The night was calm when LeBron James arrived at the luxurious hotel. Unlike what many would expect from an NBA star, he was not surrounded by an entourage of security guards or fans. He was wearing a discreet sweatshirt, a cap covering part of his face, and a pair of sneakers that any ordinary person could wear. For him, this was not a matter of hiding, but of simply enjoying a moment of peace. After years of fame, he knew that his presence always caused a bit of a stir, and that night, all he wanted was a little anonymity. The hotel lobby was busy, with guests chatting animatedly and staff milling around. LeBron crossed the space without rushing, taking in his surroundings. He had been there before, he knew the place better than anyone. But that night, he decided to experience the reception like any other guest. He approached the service counter, patiently waiting his turn. The luxurious environment exuded sophistication, with large chandeliers illuminating every detail of the polished marble. The people around were wearing elegant clothes, and the impression was that everyone there belonged to that universe of wealth and exclusivity. While waiting to be served, he noticed some suspicious looks. A couple next to him analyzed him with some strangeness, as if they were trying to understand what a man dressed so simply was doing there. LeBron was used to quick, superficial judgments, but he never let it bother him. He knew exactly who he was and what he had achieved. When his turn finally came, he leaned slightly over the counter and smiled politely at the receptionist, who, without even looking up, responded coldly, "Isn't it?" The impersonal way in which he was treated did not go unnoticed. Unlike the warm service that other guests received, his presence seemed like a nuisance. The receptionist, still busy typing on the computer, showed no interest in even asking what he needed. LeBron took a deep breath, remaining calm. "I wasn't there to prove anything to anyone. All I wanted was our reservation and a peaceful stay." What he didn't know was that night, his patience would be tested in an unexpected way. How many times have you been judged by your appearance before you even get a chance to say a word? Have you ever felt that? Because you wear something simple or act discreetly, the people around you automatically put you in an inferior position. LeBron James, one of the greatest basketball players in history, was about to live this experience, firsthand and in the worst possible way. He didn't need pomp or recognition that night. He just wanted to be treated with respect. But what if you were in his shoes? How would you react when you realize that someone decides your worth just by what you see on the outside? Leave your comment. Have you ever been through something like this? How did you deal with this situation? The receptionist finally looked up from her computer, and the expression on her face instantly changed. It wasn't a look of curiosity or sympathy, but a look filled with judgment. She frowned slightly, as if she was trying to understand what the man was doing there. Hyzes quickly glanced over LeBron's simple outfit, his ordinary sweatshirt, the cap pulled low, and the sneakers that, despite being high quality, didn't scream ostentation like the ones many of the guests were used to wearing. To her, he was nothing more than someone who was in the wrong place. Her first impression was evident in the way she raised an eyebrow in disbelief. Before he could even say a word, she pursed her lips, sighed, and asked a question she hadn't asked any of her previous customers. "Are you sure you're in the right hotel?" he said with a tone full of irony. LeBron remained calm. He had dealt with this kind of thing before, but he always wondered what made some people judge so quickly. He took a deep breath, showing a slight smile, and replied politely, "Yes, I'm in the right place. I would like to check in." The receptionist crossed her arms, clearly uncomfortable with the idea that this man wanted to stay there. The other customers, dressed in refined suits and designer dresses, were greeted with smiles and a welcoming tone. But for him, the reception was different. She made no attempt to hide her disdain, as if she was already sure she was wasting time. "Our hotel has a very high standard, sir," she insisted, as if she were giving him a warning. "The rates here are not cheap." Silence took over for a moment. The way she highlighted the words made it clear that her intention was not to inform, but to push him away. She wanted him to understand, in a subtle way, that this hotel was not for everyone. But LeBron was unfazed. He just kept his gaze steady without looking away. He knew that soon that woman would understand the magnitude of the mistake she was making. The receptionist snorted discreetly, but enough for Lebron to notice her impatience. Her fingers drummed on the counter before she finally decided to open the reservation system, but still, she didn't make a point of hiding her disinterest. His eyes moved slowly over the screen, as if searching for a justification to deny service. After a long sigh, she looked at him again, with a forced smile that looked more like a provocation. "And what would be the name of the reservation, sir?" he asked, dragging his words, as if he were doing him a favor by not even asking. Lebron maintained his posture without showing any discomfort. He knew exactly what was happening there, but he wanted to see how far she would go with that behavior. James, LeBron James. At the same moment, the receptionist let out a muffled laugh. It was an involuntary reflex, as if I had just heard the most absurd thing in the world. She quickly looked around, checking if anyone else had heard, as if hoping others would share her disbelief. For her, it could only be a joke. "Right, sir." "James." He repeated the name with a mocking tone. "Unfortunately, we do not have any reservations in your name, and as I said, the daily rates here are very high, but perhaps there is something more affordable in smaller hotels a few blocks away." The insinuation was clear. Not only did she suggest that he couldn't afford to stay, but she also made a point of reinforcing that he should look for a more suitable place for someone like him. The condescending tone in his voice was almost as cutting as the look of contempt he gave. To her, Lebron was nothing more than an ordinary man trying to infiltrate an environment where he didn't belong. Lebron smiled slightly, but not because he thought it was funny. He had been in similar situations before, but it never ceased to be surprising. He rested his hands on the counter, leaning forward slightly, not threateningly, but enough so that his presence was felt. He still hadn't said who he really was, but the receptionist was about to find out the hard way. The silence that followed the receptionist's comment was almost as heavy as the judgment-laden atmosphere. Some nearby guests, who until then had been distracted by their own conversations, began to notice her harsh tone and cast curious glances in the direction of the counter. The way she emphasized that the hotel was not for everyone caught our attention, mainly because it was completely different from the kind and polite way in which she served other customers moments before. An elegantly dressed woman who was waiting for her turn in line raised her eyebrows, surprised by the cold and rude treatment. A man in a suit who looked like a high-level businessman was watching the scene from the corner of his eye, intrigued. Everyone began to notice that something was out of the ordinary, and the discomfort grew. Even so, the receptionist did not show the slightest regret. On the contrary, she seemed satisfied with her attempt to discourage Lebron from staying there. "As I said, Mr. James," she repeated, now speaking a little louder, as if she wanted everyone to hear. "Our hotel values exclusivity. Our audience fares select. Many people try to stay here without really understanding the kind of standards we require." She emphasized the last sentence with a sharp look, making her meaning clear. For her, Lebron didn't fit that standard. It was almost as if she was suggesting that he should accept his position and just get out of there before he embarrasses himself further. But, ironically, the only person who started to embarrass herself without realizing it was herself. At this point, some people started whispering among themselves. A young man who was sitting near the lobby, checking his cell phone, looked at Lebron for a few seconds and widened his eyes when he recognized him. He discreetly nudged his friend beside him, muttering something that made her also look more closely. Little by little, the truth began to spread throughout the room, and the embarrassment that the receptionist was trying to inflict was about to backfire on her. Lebron remained calm, watching the receptionist with a calm, almost patient look. He could end that situation in seconds, but he decided to wait a little longer. There was something intriguing about seeing how far this woman would go before realizing the size of the mistake she was making. Lebron took a deep breath. Anyone else in his place would have already reacted, perhaps raised their voice or simply walked away. But he wasn't just anyone. Throughout his life, he learned that patience was a powerful weapon. No matter what he faced, he knew that maintaining control was the key to turning any situation in his favor, and that was one of those situations. He noticed the curious looks around him, felt the buzz growing, and noticed that some people were already starting to recognize him. Still, The receptionist remained blinded by her own arrogance, completely oblivious to the fact that she was seconds away from making one of the biggest mistakes of her life. He leaned lightly on the counter, taking his time, without showing any trace of anger or frustration. His gaze was serene, his expression impenetrable. "Okay," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Can I speak to the manager?" The receptionist blinked, looking like she couldn't believe what she heard. She tilted her head to the side and let out a discreet laugh, as if she found the question absurd. For her, that man did not deserve the manager's attention. There was no reason for someone in a higher position to waste time dealing with a situation like that. "The manager is too busy to answer questions like that, sir," she said, putting an exaggerated tone on the word sir, as if she wanted to reinforce the difference in status between them. "But if you want to talk to him so much," she gave a small smile, picked up the phone and dialed slowly, her gaze filled with disdain. The dramatic pause he took before speaking seemed purposeful, as if he was trying to make Lebron feel even smaller. "Mr. Ricardo," she said, her sweet and polite voice changing drastically when speaking to her superior, "there is a guest here insisting to speak to you." The way he emphasized the word guest was almost mocking, as if he were referring to someone unwanted. She turned her back, whispering a few words into the phone before setting it back down on the cradle with a victorious look. "He's already on his way," she said, crossing her arms, as if anxiously awaiting the moment when the manager would confirm her suspicion that the man didn't belong there. What she didn't know was that this was the worst decision she could have made. The receptionist kept her arms crossed and a satisfied smile on her face, certain that manager Ricardo would appear to reaffirm everything she believed. For her, that man in front of the counter had no right to be there, and the presence of her superior would only serve to reinforce that. Time seemed to drag by as they waited. The hotel lobby was quieter than before, the surrounding guests exchanging glances and wondering how this would end. Their tension was palpable, but Lebron, as always, remained impassive, observing the scene patiently. He already knew what was coming next. The sound of firm footsteps echoed throughout the room, and soon an elegant man wearing an impeccable suit appeared. Ricardo, the hotel manager, was an experienced man used to dealing with demanding customers and unusual situations, but nothing prepared him for what he saw at that moment. As soon as his eyes fell on LeBron James, his expression changed drastically. The professional and neutral look he usually maintained gave way to a mixture of surprise and absolute respect. His body, which previously carried a rigid posture of authority, relaxed for an instant, before he took an action that caught everyone by surprise. "Mr. James!" he exclaimed, his voice full of excitement and wonder. He quickly walked towards the counter, completely ignoring the receptionist, who blinked several times, not understanding what was happening. Her confidence began to waver when she saw the manager firmly extend his hand, a genuine smile forming on his face. LeBron accepted the greeting, and the respectful way in which Ricardo held his hand for a few seconds made it clear that he knew exactly who he was dealing with. "It's an honor to welcome you here," continued the manager, still in disbelief. "If we had known you were coming, we would have prepared something special for your stay." The receptionist felt her stomach drop. The manager's words resonated like an electric shock in his mind. The smug smile he carried before was completely gone, replaced by an expression of pure panic. His eyes went from Ricardo to LeBron, and then back to Ricardo, as if he expected this whole thing to be a mistake. But it wasn't. She had treated with contempt no less than the true owner of that place. The receptionist's face turned pale the moment she heard the manager's words. The victorious smile he carried until moments ago evaporated, giving way to an expression of pure discomfort. She blinked several times, trying to take in what was happening, but Herberty felt frozen. His heart skipped a beat when he realized that everyone around him was paying attention to the scene, waiting to see what would happen next. Ricardo, on the other hand, maintained a completely different stance. Still smiling, he looked around and noticed the curious looks of the guests and employees who had stopped to observe. The tension in the room was evident, and he knew he needed to clarify the situation. He turned to the receptionist, who remained static behind the counter, desperately waiting for an explanation that would undo this humiliating scenario. "I think there's a big misunderstanding here," said the manager, still maintaining a polite tone but carrying a weight that made the air around him seem thicker. "Mr. James is not just any guest. He is, in fact, one of the main investors in this hotel." The revelation fell like a bomb in the lobby. Some people gasped, others exchanged incredulous looks. The young man who had already recognized Lebron smiled sideways, as if he had been waiting for that moment. The receptionist, however, felt her world fall apart. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. His breathing was uneven. His hands were shaking slightly on the counter. "Is he the owner?" muttered a lady who was watching the scene, discreetly pulling her husband by the arm. "Yes, and not just this one," added the manager without taking his eyes off Lebron, "but of the entire hotel chain in which we are part." It was as if time had stopped. The receptionist's arrogance gave way to absolute panic. What once seemed like an opportunity to demonstrate power over someone she deemed unworthy of being there now turned into an irreversible mistake. She realized that she had not only humiliated one of the greatest athletes in the world, but also the man who, ultimately, could decide her future there. The receptionist felt a chill run down her spine. His eyes blinked rapidly, trying to absorb what he had just heard, but his mind seemed to have stopped. The manager's words echoed in his head like the ringing of a bell, repeating itself over and over again. "He is one of the owners of the hotel." The revelation destroyed any trace of the superiority she felt minutes ago. His body remained motionless, as if trapped in some sort of trance. For the first time, that night she didn't know what to do or what to say. The entire lobby was plunged into suffocating silence. Guests, employees, and even some people who were just passing by had stopped to watch the scene. All eyes were on their receptionist, waiting for a reaction. It was as if the world had stopped for a moment, holding its breath to see what would happen next. She tried to swallow hard, but her throat felt closed. His face was burning with shame, his heart hammering in his chest like a war drum. How could that happen? How did you not realize who he was? Why had he been so arrogant? Each question that appeared in his mind only increased the despair that took over his body. The young man who had already recognized Lebron before looked at his friend and shook his head in a mix of astonishment and satisfaction. Other guests whispered among themselves, some clearly amused by the receptionist's embarrassment, while others just watched silently, waiting to see what would come next. Lebron, however, remained calm. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was already there, written in the shocked expression of the woman in front of her. He watched her for a moment, without any trace of arrogance or revenge in his gaze, but only patience. What Hugh wanted was already happening. The manager crossed his arms and slightly raised an eyebrow, also waiting for some explanation. But the receptionist remained motionless, her mind desperately trying to find a way out of this disaster. The shame was so intense that she felt like disappearing, but the worst was yet to come. She knew she needed to say something, but any word at that moment felt like a sentence against herself, and in front of all those attentive eyes, her silence only made everything even more humiliating. The unbearable silence hung in the air, pressing down on the receptionist, as if the environment itself were against her. Every second that passed seemed like an eternity. Her face was pale, her hands were shaking slightly on the counter, and her heart was beating so hard that she could feel the pulse in her throat. Her gaze moved from side to side, looking for any sign of support, anyone who could intercede for her, but there was no one. Everyone was there, just watching, waiting for his reaction. It was then that, with no alternative, she finally tried to regain control of the situation. He took a deep breath, forced a shaky smile, and tried to adopt a softer tone of voice, as if everything was just a mistake. "Mr. James, I'm really sorry about what happened," he said, swallowing hard. "I think there was a misunderstanding." She tried to smile, but insecurity showed in every word. The fear and despair were there, disguised under a veneer of false tranquility. But no one believed that excuse. The eyes around her remained attentive, and Lebron maintained his calm expression without showing any impatience or desire to humiliate her. He just watched, waiting to see how far she would take this attempt at redemption. "I didn't know that." She hesitated, immediately correcting herself. "I mean, I didn't recognize you, sir. If I had known, of course I would have." She stopped. Her own sentence condemned her. If you had known who he was, would you have treated him differently? So was that the criteria for offering respectful service? The weight of her own speech fell on her like an avalanche. Manager Ricardo sighed, disappointed. He crossed his arms and shook his head slowly, making it clear that the excuse wasn't enough. The damage was already done. The receptionist, realizing that there was no easy way out, lowered her eyes, feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Forgive me, Mr. James. I really didn't mean to be disrespectful," he said, his voice shaking. But there was no turning back. The shame wasn't just about treating a guest badly. It was because she was caught in the act, because she showed the world the prejudice that she herself didn't know she carried. And now, in front of everyone, she would have to face the consequences. The hotel lobby remained completely silent. Everyone waited to see how Lebron would respond to the receptionist's apology, but he remained motionless, watching her with a calm gaze. He didn't seem angry, he didn't show resentment, but there was something about his posture that made everyone hold their breath. The receptionist, still shaking, lowered her head, hoping that he would quickly accept her excuse so that this awkward moment could end. But Lebron wasn't interested in revenge or humiliation. He saw something much bigger in that situation. He took a deep breath, crossed his arms, and finally broke the silence. His voice was calm but firm enough for everyone to hear clearly. "You said there was a misunderstanding," he began, looking directly at the receptionist. "But let's be honest, there was no misunderstanding. You understood exactly what you wanted to understand the moment you saw me." The impact of his words caused the receptionist's face to turn even redder. The murmur among the guests increased, and Manager Ricardo lowered his head, visibly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "The problem wasn't that I didn't have a backup or you didn't know who I was," Lebron continued. "The problem is that in your mind, I didn't seem to belong here. You looked at me and, without even knowing me, decided that I wasn't worthy of the same respect you gave everyone else before me." The receptionist opened her mouth to say something, perhaps another attempt to justify her behavior, but no words came out, because deep down she knew he was right. Lebron took a step back and looked around. His gaze swept over the attentive faces of guests, employees, and even some people who were just passing by the hotel. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "How many times has someone gone through something like this? How many people have been treated as invisible because someone decided they didn't belong?" The lobby remained silent. It was impossible not to reflect on those words. Lebron didn't raise his voice, he didn't get excited, but his message was stronger than any scream. He didn't need to humiliate anyone. The truth itself was already doing this for him. The impact of Lebron's words still hung in the air like an invisible weight, leaving everyone in the hotel lobby immersed in silent reflection. The receptionist, now completely vulnerable, kept her eyes downcast, unable to meet the gazes around her. His body was rigid, as if every fiber of him understood that this moment was not just a passing embarrassment, but rather a turning point in his life. Manager Ricardo, who until then had been following the scene in silence, knew he needed to act. He took a deep breath, adjusted the cuffs of his suit, and stepped forward, positioning himself between Lebron and the receptionist. His expression was serious, and the tension in his gaze showed that he understood the gravity of the situation. As the hotel's leader, I knew this wasn't just a customer service issue. It was a reflection of the culture he allowed within, the environment he commanded. He turned to the receptionist, who still didn't dare lift her head. "What happened here today is unacceptable," he said, with a firm but non-aggressive tone of voice. "We treat all our guests with respect regardless of appearance, dress, or anything else. That is a fundamental principle of this hotel, and you have failed it." The receptionist felt a lump forming in her throat, but remained silent. There were no more excuses that could save her. She knew she had made a mistake. Hearing those words, he realized that his behavior not only exposed his own arrogance, but also put the hotel's reputation at risk. The manager paused briefly before continuing. "Given what happened here, I cannot allow you to continue representing this hotel," he announced. From now on, you are relieved of your duties. The receptionist's eyes widened. Even though he was already expecting the worst, hearing those words out loud made his heart race. A shiver ran up his spine, and his world seemed to fall apart all at once. She tried to mumble something, but the words stuck in her throat. There was nothing he could do. Her attitude had consequences, and now she would have to deal with them. Thessalence in the lobby grew even heavier as Lebron remained standing still, without any trace of vengeance on his face. He hadn't asked for it, but he knew it was necessary. Some lessons needed to be learned the hard way. The hotel lobby felt like another place. The same environment that minutes ago was filled with arrogance and prejudice was now dominated by reflective silence. The manager's announcement still echoed in the receptionist's mind, who remained standing behind the counter, feeling her body weighing down like never before. What she thought was a position of power became her own undoing. His haughty posture, the way he looked down on his guests, all of that disappeared in seconds. Now she was nothing more than a weakened woman who understood too late the mistake she had made. She finally looked up, but found no anger in Lebron. He didn't seem pleased. With his dismissal, there was no arrogance or superiority in his expression. On the contrary, he just looked disappointed. As someone who has faced immeasurable challenges, he knew that the most painful defeats are not those that come from outside, but those that we impose on ourselves through our wrong choices. The receptionist opened her mouth, perhaps to beg for another chance, but realized it was no use. Some failures are irreversible. If I had treated Lebron with respect from the beginning, none of this would have happened. It didn't matter if he was a regular customer or the owner of the hotel. Every human being deserves respect. And now she was solely responsible for her own destiny. The surrounding guests not only witnessed the scene, but left with something bigger than just a story to tell. Some were still whispering, impressed by what they had seen, while others just looked at Lebron in awe. What happened that night wasn't just about a misunderstanding or a professional mistake. It was a reminder of how much we judge others by their appearance, how ready we are to define who deserves respect and who doesn't, based on empty assumptions. Lebron turned to the manager, nodded in a respectful gesture, and headed towards the elevator, without looking back. He didn't need revenge, he didn't need anything else. Thelison had been taught. The receptionist, who previously saw herself as someone above others, now knew exactly what it meant to be treated with indifference. And from then on, noon in that hotel would ever forget what had happened that night. How many times have you been judged before you even have the chance to show who you really are? Have you ever been in a situation where someone belittled you just because of your appearance or the way you presented yourself? LeBron James' story reminds us that respect should be non-negotiable, regardless of status, money, or recognition. But what about you? Have you ever experienced something similar? How did you react? Tell us in the comments your experience or your opinion about this story. If you've made it this far, it's because this story made you reflect. What happened to LeBron James is not just a story about a mistake, but a great lesson about respect, humility, and how hasty judgments can cost us dearly. We want to know how this video touched your heart. Have you ever experienced something similar? How did this message speak to you? Comment below, as your opinion is very important to us. And before you leave, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving transformative content. Leave a like to support this mission, and of course watch the next video that is already on the final screen. See you there.